What if I told you that history's greatest military genius, the man who conquered most of Europe and made emperors bow before him, died begging like a broken child for just one spoonful of sweetened water? That the same hands which once commanded over 1,000,000 soldiers trembled helplessly as his own body turned against him in the most savage way imaginable? You've heard the sanitized version. Napoleon Bonaparte, defeated at Waterloo, exiled to Saint Helena, died quietly in 1821. End of story. But what really happened during those final weeks would make even the most experienced war surgeons turn away in horror. This isn't the Napoleon of your history textbooks. This is the story of how Europe's most feared conqueror became unrecognizable to his own devoted servants. His brilliant mind shattered by agony while his flesh literally rotted away piece by piece. Most people believe Napoleon simply faded away on his island prison, perhaps from poison or a broken heart. The truth is infinitely more disturbing. His death was so brutal, so prolonged, and so grotesque that the British Empire tried to bury the details. They succeeded for decades, but physician notes, eyewitness accounts, and autopsy reports tell a different story. A story of medical torture disguised as treatment, of a man's body cannibalizing itself while he remained conscious, and of the complete psychological destruction of someone who once held the fate of nations in his hands. Saint Helena in 1821 was about as close to hell on earth as the British could manage without actually killing their most dangerous prisoner. Located 1,200 miles from the nearest landmass in the South Atlantic, this volcanic rock served as the perfect cage for a man who had escaped exile once before. The island was humid, oppressive, and crawling with rats. For someone accustomed to the palaces of Europe, it was designed to break spirits. But something else was breaking Napoleon, something far more sinister than British psychological warfare. By early 1821, Napoleon's daily routine had become a study in gradual collapse. The man who once reviewed 50,000 troops in a single morning now struggled to walk from his bedroom to his study without stopping to catch his breath. His longtime valet, Louis Marchand, noticed the changes first. Napoleon had always been particular about his appearance, spending exactly 15 minutes each morning on his toilet. Now those 15 minutes stretched to an hour, then two, not from vanity but from necessity. Simple tasks like buttoning his vest had become monumental challenges. His hands shook uncontrollably, and his coordination was failing. The bathing ritual started innocently enough. Napoleon had always enjoyed his daily bath, but on Saint Helena, these sessions became obsessions. What began as 30-minute soaks stretched into marathon sessions lasting 6, 7, sometimes 8 hours. The water temperature would be scalding hot, so hot that steam filled the small bathroom and his skin turned an angry red. Marchand would add boiling water periodically as Napoleon lay there, gripping the copper edges of the tub with white knuckles. Why the extended baths? The heat was the only thing that quieted the fire in his abdomen. Outside that tub, every movement sent waves of agony through his midsection. He described it to his physician as feeling like red-hot coals were shifting inside his belly with each breath. The irony wasn't lost on him. The emperor who had marched his armies through burning Moscow summers and frozen Russian winters was now defeated by his own digestive system. Food became his enemy. Napoleon, who had famously eaten his meals in under 10 minutes throughout his campaigns, now couldn't tolerate even the smell of cooking. His chef, desperate to find something the emperor could stomach, prepared increasingly bland broths and thin soups. Even these simple offerings often came back up within minutes, sometimes mixed with blood that looked like coffee grounds. The isolation of Saint Helena magnified every symptom. In Paris or Vienna, Napoleon would have had access to the finest physicians in Europe. On this remote island, he was treated by British doctors who viewed him as both patient and prisoner. Their loyalty was to the crown first, the Hippocratic oath second. This conflict of interest would prove catastrophic. Modern medicine would recognize Napoleon's symptoms immediately: gastric carcinoma, stomach cancer in its advanced stages. But in 1821, cancer was poorly understood, often misdiagnosed, and almost always fatal. What was growing inside Napoleon wasn't just any tumor. Post-mortem examination would reveal a malignant mass over 4 inches long, wrapped around his stomach like a biological snake. This wasn't a recent development. Cancer typically grows slowly, meaning Napoleon had likely been harboring this killer for years, possibly even during his final campaigns. It adds a chilling perspective to his last desperate gamble at Waterloo. Was the man who changed the course of European history already fighting a losing battle inside his own body while he fought the coalition armies? The tumor was strategically positioned near the pylorus, the narrow passage between the stomach and small intestine. As it grew, it gradually strangled this vital pathway. Food couldn't pass through properly. Stomach acid, with nowhere to go, began eating away at Napoleon's stomach lining. His body was quite literally digesting itself. By March 1821, the cancer had progressed to stage 4. The tumor had begun to ulcerate, creating open wounds inside his stomach. These lesions bled constantly, explaining the coffee ground vomit that terrified his servants. Worse, the cancer had started to metastasize. Microscopic seeds of malignancy were spreading through his lymph nodes and blood vessels, establishing new colonies of disease throughout his abdomen. The physical changes were unmistakable to anyone who had known Napoleon in his prime. Count Montholon, who had served with him since before Waterloo, could barely hide his shock at the emperor's transformation. Napoleon's arms, which had once grabbed cannon wheels and repositioned artillery pieces mid-battle, had withered to skeletal appendages. You could count every rib through his yellowing skin. But the most disturbing change was his abdomen. While the rest of his body wasted away, his belly had swollen grotesquely. The cancer was causing fluid retention, filling his abdominal cavity with liquid. He looked like a starving man who had swallowed a balloon. The weight distribution was so unnatural that when he attempted to walk, he had to lean backward to maintain balance, giving him the appearance of a pregnant skeleton. The smell was becoming unbearable. As the tumor grew larger, parts of it began to die and putrefy while Napoleon was still alive. The sweet, cloying odor of rotting tissue permeated his quarters. His servants burned incense and sulfur candles constantly, but nothing could mask the smell of death emanating from within a living body. Napoleon's psychological decline was perhaps more heartbreaking than his physical deterioration. This was a man whose mental acuity had been legendary. He could dictate 4 letters simultaneously to different secretaries while planning military campaigns in his head. His memory was so precise that he could recall the names and service records of individual soldiers from battles fought years earlier. But cancer affects more than just the organ it inhabits. The constant pain, the medications, the malnutrition, and the toxic byproducts of dying tissue all conspired to attack his cognitive functions. By mid-April, Napoleon's mental clarity came and went like clouds passing over the sun. The hallucinations began as brief episodes. He would suddenly sit up in bed, his skeletal frame alert, and begin giving military orders to people who weren't there. "Position the artillery on that ridge," he would command, pointing to empty air. "Send word to Marshal Ney that we advance at dawn." His voice carried all the authority of his prime, but he was commanding phantom armies on imaginary battlefields. These episodes grew longer and more elaborate. Napoleon would spend hours refighting his greatest victories, his hands moving across invisible maps as he orchestrated troop movements against enemies who had been dead for decades. To his servants, watching this brilliant military mind replay its glory days while trapped in a failing body was almost unbearably tragic. Sometimes the hallucinations were pleasant escapes. He would call for Josephine, his first wife, speaking to her as if she were sitting beside his bed. He would tell her about their early days together, before the crown came between them, his voice soft and loving. The fact that Josephine had died 7 years earlier seemed irrelevant to his damaged brain. Other times, the delusions were terrifying. He would suddenly cry out warnings about Russian cavalry charges or Austrian flanking maneuvers. His servants would find him trying to crawl under his bed, convinced that enemy artillery was targeting his position. The man who had faced death unflinchingly at dozens of battles was now cowering from imaginary cannons. Dr. Francesco Antimarchi, Napoleon's Italian physician, documented these episodes with clinical detachment. What emerged from his notes was a picture of cognitive destruction as methodical as any military campaign. Memory, judgment, perception, and reasoning were all under assault. The emperor's mind was becoming a battlefield where past and present collided in increasingly violent ways. The saddest moments came when clarity would briefly return. Napoleon would look around his room, see the concerned faces of his servants, and realize what was happening to him. "I'm losing myself," he confided to Montholin during one lucid interval. "Sometimes I can't tell if I'm here or at Austerlitz. Sometimes I can't tell if I'm 50 or 30. These moments of self-awareness were perhaps more cruel than the delusions themselves. The British approach to Napoleon's medical care was complicated by politics, primitive understanding of disease, and quite possibly deliberate malice. Dr. Archibald Arnott, the British Navy physician assigned to treat him, represented early 19th century medicine at its most barbaric. His treatments read like a manual for systematic torture. When Napoleon's digestive system began shutting down completely, when he hadn't produced a bowel movement in over a week, Arnott prescribed calomel. 10 grains of mercurous chloride. Today, we know mercury as a deadly poison that causes kidney failure, brain damage, and death. In 1821, it was considered a miracle cure for constipation and digestive disorders. The first dose produced results that should have terrified any competent physician. Napoleon evacuated his bowels with such violence that servants had to change his bedding 3 times. What emerged wasn't normal waste but a black, tar-like substance that reeked of decay and blood. Internal bleeding had been occurring for so long that his digestive tract had become a reservoir of corrupted blood and tissue. Any modern doctor would have immediately stopped the mercury treatment. Arnott saw it as proof the medicine was working and prescribed another 10 grains. The mercury didn't just affect Napoleon's digestive system. It began attacking his nervous system, his kidneys, and his brain. The tremors in his hands worsened. His speech became slurred. His already compromised mental state deteriorated further as mercury poisoning compounded the effects of cancer and malnutrition. But Arnott wasn't finished. When the mercury failed to provide lasting relief, he turned to blistering agents. These were patches soaked in cantharides, extract from crushed blister beetles. Applied to the skin, they caused severe chemical burns that would blister and weep for days. The theory was that external pain would somehow draw out internal disease, like a biological lightning rod. They placed these torture devices on Napoleon's chest, feet, and calves. His yellow, jaundiced skin soon featured angry red welts that oozed clear fluid constantly. The pain was excruciating, but according to medical theory of the time, this was therapeutic pain. They were literally burning him alive as treatment. When even these extreme measures failed to provide relief, Arnott escalated to enemas. Not gentle medicinal washings, but violent forced irrigations using mercury-laced water under pressure. The procedure required 4 men to hold Napoleon down while a 5th operated the apparatus. The emperor, who had never shown fear in battle, who had walked through grape-shot fire without flinching, screamed during these procedures. The psychological impact was devastating. Here was a man who had commanded absolute respect from millions, being held down like a child while strangers violated his body in the most intimate way possible. After one particularly brutal session, Napoleon turned his face to the wall and refused to acknowledge anyone in the room for the rest of the day. The tragic irony is that all of these treatments probably hastened his death. The mercury poisoning weakened his already compromised system. The burns diverted his body's limited energy toward healing superficial wounds instead of fighting cancer. The violent enemas caused additional trauma to his diseased digestive tract. In trying to cure him, his doctors were systematically destroying him. By May 1821, Napoleon had entered the terminal phase of his illness. What happened next challenges our understanding of human endurance and the limits of suffering. May 3rd marked the point of no return. Dr. Arnott, apparently believing that previous treatments hadn't been aggressive enough, administered 20 grains of calomel. This was double the previous dose of mercury, enough to kill a healthy person outright. But they didn't stop there. Without waiting to see the effects of this massive poisoning, they followed it immediately with another violent enema. The combined assault triggered a cascade of systemic failure. Napoleon's body, already pushed beyond its limits, began shutting down organ by organ. The mercury attacked his nervous system, causing violent tremors and seizures. His kidneys, overwhelmed by toxins, began failing. His liver, already damaged by years of illness, stopped processing waste effectively. But the most horrifying development was in his digestive system. The combination of cancer, mercury poisoning, and violent mechanical trauma from the enemas caused his stomach to begin literally falling apart. Napoleon started vomiting chunks of tissue, pieces of his own stomach lining that had been torn away by the convulsions. His stool, when he could produce any, contained fragments of intestinal wall. His body was eliminating parts of itself. The emperor was dissolving from within while remaining conscious enough to understand what was happening. The hallucinations reached their peak during this phase. Napoleon was simultaneously fighting the Battle of Austerlitz, planning his Egyptian campaign, and trying to escape from Elba. His servants would find him positioned at the foot of his bed, his emaciated arms moving pieces on an invisible chessboard of European politics while his actual body expelled its own organs. Dr. Antimarchi documented every detail with scientific precision. His notes described Napoleon's eyes becoming completely bloodshot as blood vessels burst from the strain of vomiting. The emperor's face, once commanding enough to cow generals, had become a grotesque mask of yellow skin stretched over sharp bones, punctuated by blood-red eyes that stared at things no one else could see. The smell in Napoleon's quarters had become so overpowering that servants could only enter in shifts. The sweet, rotten odor of cancerous tissue mixed with the metallic smell of blood and the acrid stench of mercury poisoning. They sealed the windows because British medical theory held that fresh air would worsen his condition, creating a sealed chamber of death where the very atmosphere seemed toxic. On May 4th, the cancer achieved what no European coalition had managed. It completely defeated Napoleon Bonaparte. The tumor had grown large enough to perforate his stomach wall entirely. A hole large enough to insert a finger had opened between his stomach and abdominal cavity. Only a miraculous adhesion to his liver, scar tissue that had formed like nature's own emergency repair, prevented his stomach contents from spilling into his body cavity and killing him instantly. He was technically alive with a gaping hole in his stomach. Modern medicine has no equivalent for this level of suffering combined with consciousness. Palliative care today would have rendered him comfortable and unconscious. In 1821, they kept him awake and aware while his body underwent this systematic destruction. May 5, 1821. At 3 a.m., Napoleon entered what physicians call the death rattle phase. His breathing became irregular, rapid gasps followed by long pauses where his chest didn't move at all. His brain was slowly losing the ability to regulate basic life functions. But even dying, Napoleon's presence commanded attention. 16 people crowded into his bedroom, creating a macabre version of imperial court. They included his faithful servants, British officials who needed to witness his death for political reasons, and doctors who were documenting one of history's most famous deaths. The irony was profound. Here was a man who had once held private audiences with kings and emperors, whose every word could shift the balance of European power. Now he was the center of attention for an entirely different reason. People were watching him die by degrees, documenting his transformation from human being to corpse. Dr. Arnott, perhaps realizing that his treatments had failed catastrophically, made one final attempt at intervention. He pressed hot water bottles against Napoleon's swollen, cancerous abdomen. The heat against the tumor caused such intense agony that Napoleon's back arched completely off the bed, his mouth open in a silent scream. His throat had swollen shut from the cancer spread, preventing even the release of crying out. They tried mustard plasters on his feet, a last-ditch effort to stimulate his failing circulation. The mustard caused chemical burns, adding yet another layer of torment to his final hours. The combination of odors in that sealed room, mustard, sulfur from the candles, the sweet smell of rotting cancer, and the metallic tang of blood created an atmosphere so thick it was almost unbreathable. Napoleon's skin had become a canvas of medical violence. Yellow from liver failure, red from burns, purple from oxygen deprivation, and translucent from malnutrition. His servants later said he looked like a living anatomy lesson, every system of his body failing in a different, visible way. Through it all, fragments of his personality emerged like islands in a sea of delirium. When consciousness briefly returned, he would try to dictate letters or issue orders, his political instincts intact even as his body fell apart. He left money in his will to the soldier who had attempted to assassinate the Duke of Wellington, one final gesture of defiance against his British captors. At 5:49 p.m. on May 5, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte's heart stopped beating. After nearly 18 hours of final agony, his body simply had nothing left to give. There were no last words, no dramatic final gesture. The most theatrical figure in European history died quietly, his epic life ending not with thunder but with silence. The next morning brought revelations that shocked even the physicians who thought they understood Napoleon's condition. When they opened his abdomen in the billiard room of Longwood House, the smell that emerged was so overpowering that several doctors had to leave the room immediately. What they found inside defied their worst expectations. Napoleon's stomach was almost entirely cancerous, the healthy tissue replaced by hard, leather-like growths. The tumor hadn't just been growing. Portions of it had been dying and putrefying while he lived, creating pockets of rotted tissue inside his body. The perforation was exactly where Dr. Antimarchi had predicted, near the pyloric sphincter. When he demonstrated by pushing his finger through the hole, the other physicians recoiled. This wasn't a clean surgical opening, but a ragged tear where cancerous tissue had simply given way under pressure. More disturbing were the white nodules scattered throughout his intestines like malignant pearls. The cancer had metastasized extensively, spreading far beyond its original location. Napoleon had been walking around with dozens of secondary tumors, each one contributing to his agony. The autopsy also revealed the full extent of the medical damage. Mercury residue was found throughout his system, concentrated in his brain and kidneys. The blistering treatments had caused deep tissue damage that extended far below the visible burns. His liver showed signs of severe toxicity from months of poisoning disguised as treatment. Perhaps most tellingly, they found evidence that Napoleon had been slowly starving. His stomach, already compromised by cancer, had been further damaged by the violent medical interventions. He had become unable to process nutrition effectively, literally wasting away despite his caregivers' efforts to feed him. The British officials present made detailed notes for their government. This wasn't just medical curiosity. This was political documentation. They needed proof that Napoleon had died of natural causes, not British mistreatment. The autopsy report was carefully edited before publication, removing the most damning details about treatment-related damage. The story should have ended with burial, but Napoleon had one final surprise waiting. When his tomb was opened 19 years later to transfer his remains to Paris, the witnesses discovered something that challenged everything they thought they knew about death and decomposition. Napoleon's body was perfectly preserved. Not partially preserved, not well preserved for the conditions, but perfectly preserved. His face was recognizable, his skin white as marble, his uniform intact down to the smallest details. After 19 years in the tropical climate of Saint Helena, he looked like he had been buried the day before. The preservation was so complete that several witnesses initially thought there had been some mistake, that they had opened the wrong grave. But the distinctive features were unmistakable. This was definitely Napoleon Bonaparte, suspended in time like a sleeping emperor waiting for resurrection. Theories about the preservation range from scientific to supernatural. Some historians suggest the mercury in his system acted as an accidental preservative, essentially mummifying him from within. Others point to the sealed lead coffin and the unique soil conditions of Saint Helena. A few romantic souls prefer to believe that history itself refused to let Napoleon's body decay, preserving him as a testament to his impact on the world. The perfectly preserved corpse created an immediate sensation in Paris. Thousands lined up to view the emperor's face one final time before his entombment in Les Invalides. Many were veterans of his campaigns, old soldiers who had followed him across Europe decades earlier. They wept openly at seeing their commander looking exactly as they remembered him, untouched by the passage of time that had aged and broken them. Napoleon's death offers a disturbing window into medical practice of the early 19th century, but it also raises questions about power, mortality, and human nature that remain relevant today. How do we treat the powerful when they become powerless? How much should politics influence medical care? And what does it mean when the most successful person of their era dies in agony while their doctors torture them in the name of healing? Modern oncology would have handled Napoleon's case entirely differently. Palliative care would have focused on comfort rather than cure once the cancer reached its advanced stage. Pain management would have been the priority, not aggressive interventions that caused additional suffering. He would have died peacefully, probably unconscious, surrounded by family rather than political observers. The mercury treatments that hastened his death serve as a reminder that good intentions and confidence don't guarantee good outcomes in medicine. Dr. Arnott genuinely believed he was helping his patient, following the best medical practices of his time. Yet his treatments were objectively torture that accelerated Napoleon's decline. This paradox continues today in different forms, as medical science advances but uncertainty remains about optimal treatments for complex conditions. There's also a broader lesson about how we mythologize historical figures. The Napoleon of popular imagination is a figure of romance and adventure, a military genius whose story reads like an epic novel. The reality was messier, more human, and ultimately more tragic. He was a brilliant man who died in agony, reduced to begging for sugar water while his body consumed itself. Perhaps most importantly, Napoleon's death reminds us that no amount of worldly power provides protection from biology. The man who had redrawn the map of Europe was helpless against a cluster of malignant cells. His armies, his titles, his genius for strategy, none of it mattered when cancer came calling. In our current era of medical advances, we sometimes forget how recently death was an arbitrary, agonizing lottery that claimed genius and fool alike. Napoleon's horrific death had immediate political consequences. The British government was accused of deliberately mistreating their famous prisoner, leading to diplomatic tensions that lasted for decades. The detailed autopsy reports, when they finally became public, sparked outrage across Europe. Many viewed his suffering as revenge rather than medical care. The preservation of his body became a powerful symbol for French nationalism. When his remains were returned to Paris in 1840, it triggered a wave of Napoleonic nostalgia that influenced French politics for generations. The perfectly preserved emperor became a rallying point for those who remembered French glory and resented British dominance. Medical science learned valuable lessons from Napoleon's case, though the knowledge came too late to help him. His autopsy was one of the most detailed ever performed on a cancer patient, providing insights that advanced understanding of gastric carcinoma. The detailed documentation of mercury poisoning effects contributed to the eventual abandonment of mercury-based treatments. Today, Napoleon's death serves as a case study in medical ethics. How do political considerations affect patient care? What happens when doctors serve multiple masters? How do we balance aggressive treatment with quality of life? These questions remain relevant in modern medical practice, particularly when treating high-profile patients whose care becomes politically charged. The story also illuminates the human cost of greatness. Napoleon achieved more in his lifetime than virtually anyone in recorded history. He transformed legal systems, redrew continental boundaries, and influenced military science for centuries. But his final weeks strip away all the glory and reveal the fundamental fragility of human existence. Genius offers no protection from suffering. Success provides no immunity from mortality. In the end, Napoleon's gruesome death may have been as historically significant as his life. Had he died peacefully in his sleep, he might have been remembered as a romantic figure of exile and lost glory. Instead, the horrific details of his final weeks created a different kind of legend. He became a martyr to British cruelty, a victim of medical incompetence, and a symbol of human suffering in the face of overwhelming power. The detailed accounts of his death, when they finally emerged, influenced medical practice, political theory, and popular culture. Writers and artists were fascinated by the contrast between his glorious life and agonizing death. The image of the great emperor reduced to a cancer-riddled skeleton became a powerful metaphor for the temporary nature of all human achievement. Modern readers might find comfort in knowing that Napoleon's specific type of suffering is largely preventable today. Advanced cancer care focuses heavily on pain management and quality of life. No patient today would endure months of agony like Napoleon experienced. Medical ethics have evolved to prioritize patient comfort over aggressive interventions that cause more harm than good. But the broader lessons of his death remain uncomfortably relevant. We still struggle with questions about end-of-life care, about when aggressive treatment becomes cruel prolongation of suffering, about how politics and medicine intersect in ways that don't always serve patients' interests. Napoleon Bonaparte conquered most of Europe, influenced legal systems still in use today, and changed the course of human history. But in his final weeks, he was reduced to the most basic human experiences: pain, fear, confusion, and the universal approach of death. His story reminds us that beneath all our achievements and pretensions, we remain biological creatures subject to the same fundamental vulnerabilities that have plagued humanity since the beginning. The emperor who once made kings bow before him died vomiting pieces of his own stomach, his brilliant mind shattered by agony, his powerful body reduced to a collection of failing organs. It's a story that strips away all illusions about power and mortality, revealing the brutal truth that death comes for everyone, often in ways we'd rather not contemplate. Yet there's something oddly inspiring about Napoleon's final struggle. Even as his body betrayed him, even as his mind fragmented, he never stopped being Napoleon. His last coherent thoughts were of France, his army, his son. He died as he had lived, focused on duty and legacy rather than personal comfort. In that sense, cancer may have destroyed his body, but it never conquered his spirit. The perfectly preserved corpse discovered 19 years later seems fitting somehow. History refused to let Napoleon decay normally, preserving him as he was meant to be remembered. The emperor who changed the world, frozen in time before entropy could claim even his physical form. Today, millions visit his tomb in Paris, marveling at the grandeur of his final resting place. Few know the full horror of how he got there, but perhaps that's as it should be. Some stories are too terrible for monuments, too disturbing for public consumption. They're preserved instead in medical notes and witness testimonies, waiting for those brave enough to look beyond the sanitized version of history and confront the brutal reality of how even legends die. Napoleon's death teaches us that greatness provides no protection from suffering, that power offers no immunity from mortality, and that in the end, we all face the same fundamental human vulnerabilities. It's a sobering lesson wrapped in one of history's most horrifying medical cases, a reminder that beneath all our achievements, we remain fragile biological creatures in an indifferent universe. The emperor who conquered nations couldn't conquer the cancer in his gut. And in that failure, perhaps, lies the most human thing about Napoleon Bonaparte. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most tragic and misunderstood stories. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel. I am dedicated to uncovering the hidden, untold stories in history. Ring that notification bell, because the next untold story will move you more than this. Until then, question the narratives, listen to the silenced voices, and never stop seeking the truth behind the legends.